In the early hours of October 12, 2023, the night sky above Kupiansk was silent, until it wasn't. A ripple of sound cut across the darkness, low at first, then building into a thunder that didn't belong to artillery, but to precision. Somewhere more than 70 kilometers away, a Ukrainian HIMARS crew completed a brief firing sequence. Their launcher elevated, fired 6 missiles in a tight ripple, and lowered again in under 30 seconds. Gone, before Russian radar even realized a firing solution existed. The targets? A rail junction, an ammunition staging ground, and the fuel stockpiles that fed Russia's entire Kupiansk front. The rockets didn't just strike. They detonated logistics. Satellites captured the aftermath hours later. Freight cars twisted like paper clips, a crater swallowing the switching station, rails warped into molten arcs. The blast didn't just destroy infrastructure, it froze the Russian front line, denying mobility, resupply, and reinforcement in one clean surgical bite. But the shock wasn't physical, it was psychological. Russian radio traffic captured that night showed panic. Where's the next train? We have no fuel. Shells are down to minimum. Even the units nowhere near the impact zone began rationing ammunition because logistics, not tanks or infantry, dictates whether an army survives tomorrow. And this is where history folds back onto itself. Because nearly 82 years earlier, on September 8, 1941, soldiers on the Eastern Front felt the exact same terror, except this time it was German troops, and the incoming fire wasn't guided by satellites. It was unleashed by a weapon the Germans had never seen before. A sound tore across their positions, not the heavy thud of artillery, not the slow scream of a mortar, but a rising wall of unearthly howling that soldiers later compared to the sky opening up. Before anyone could shout cover, a Soviet Katyusha battery poured explosive fire across rear German lines, igniting depots, smashing trucks, and sending fuel convoys skyward in sheets of flame. It wasn't accuracy that mattered. It was shock. German troops at the time thought the Soviets had invented some kind of hell organ, a demonic launcher. They didn't even know its real name, BM-13 Katyusha. They just called it Stalinorgel. Stalin's organ, because it screamed before it killed. That first major strike outside Moscow in 1941 didn't stop the Wehrmacht like a wall. It slowed them, logistically bled them, until winter finished what the rockets started. People often imagine wars are decided by tanks or infantry charges. But modern war and World War II both prove the same brutal truth. Front lines don't collapse from the outside. They collapse from the supply lines inward. Kupiansk was not the first time a rocket strike made an enemy realize its advance was now starvation on wheels. When the HIMARS volley silenced the rail hub in 2023, Russian commanders weren't looking at a battlefield defeat. They were looking at a calendar, at how long their shells, fuel, and replacements would last before combat power evaporated by itself. Exactly like the Germans did in 1941. One Soviet officer during early Moscow defense wrote, "A supply column destroyed is a battalion that never arrives." 82 years later, a Ukrainian logistics officer echoed it almost word for word. If the rail dies, the brigade dies next. 2 wars, 2 continents, 2 armies convinced momentum alone would carry them forward until rockets found their arteries. The soldiers in Kupiansk didn't just lose a rail junction. They felt something deeper. They were now fighting history and losing to a familiar pattern.
The morning after the Kupiansk strike, Russian command posts across the sector weren't asking who fired. They already knew. The real question was how many more times it would happen. Because once HIMARS has your coordinates, logistics isn't a support function anymore. It becomes a high-risk target environment. Fuel depots began relocating in a panic. Pallets loaded in the dark, convoys scrambling without escort, drivers abandoning vehicles at the first rumble of distant engines. Units that were supposed to attack were suddenly busy hiding their fuel instead of using it. This is always the silent pivot in a modern war. Not the day troops run out of shells, the day they become afraid of resupply itself. Across the radio net, frontline companies started asking questions their commanders couldn't answer. If the ammo truck moves, can it survive? If the fuel convoy rolls, who's covering the route? Are we fighting or retreating without saying retreat? Exactly the same paralysis spread through the German lines in September 1941. Katyusha wasn't a precision platform, it was a terror platform, but the effect was identical. Convoys scattered, offloaded supplies burned in place, roads choked with abandoned trucks. The Wehrmacht had never seen massed rocket fire before. They were masters of artillery, but rockets were alien, monstrous, unpredictable. Survivors from that first strike outside Moscow described it as not bombardment, obliteration, no warning, just fire. The Germans built their entire early war doctrine on speed and uninterrupted fuel flow. Blitzkrieg wasn't magic. It was logistics on wheels. When the wheels stopped, the doctrine died with it. And what made Katyusha especially devastating wasn't raw damage. It was what it forced the Germans to do. They stopped trusting the rear areas. The same psychological fracture now ripples through Russian logistics units in 2023-2024. A truck driver can replace a wheel. He can't replace certainty. The HIMARS strike didn't just remove a rail junction. It removed confidence in the chain behind it. And in war, the moment supply officers start guessing instead of knowing, collapse is already scheduled, just not officially announced. The shockwave no soldier sees, but every soldier feels. In both wars, the first victims weren't frontline infantry. They were the men behind them, the drivers who suddenly refused to move at night, the engineers too afraid to repair a depot, the quartermasters rationing fuel like it was blood plasma. When a logistics system gets scared, it behaves like a wounded animal. Twitchy, slow, self-protective. The front line? It starves quietly while headquarters still pretends the situation is stable. In 1941, German panzer commanders began sending frantic requests for fuel that never came. In 2023, Russian brigade HQs were asking for shells that no longer had a safe rail corridor to reach them. The battlefield never announces collapse. It withers toward it. History doesn't repeat by accident. It repeats by structure. The Soviet Union in 1941 had few advantages against a mechanized German army. But it understood one principle instinctively: frighten the enemy behind the front, and the front will break on its own. Ukraine today is executing the same logic with better tools. Where Katyusha fired in a screaming curtain of unguided death, HIMARS fires with the quiet precision of a scalpel. One weapon floods a grid square. The other chooses a nerve and severs it. But the message is identical across 82 years. You will run out before we do. And so the modern Russian soldier, staring at a stalled fuel truck on a broken rail spur, is closer to the 1941 German infantrymen than he realizes. Both are discovering, in different centuries, that no army outruns a hungry supply line. The rockets don't chase the soldiers. They chase the road behind them. And when the road dies, so does momentum.
Before rockets destroy armies, they destroy certainty. In 1941, German soldiers believed they had already seen the worst the Red Army could throw at them. Artillery barrages? Expected. Mortars? Familiar. Counter-battery fire? Routine. The Wehrmacht was hardened by victories and momentum, until the night the sky itself began to scream. The first Katyusha strike outside Moscow didn't just land on fuel depots. It announced itself like a voice from hell. The Germans heard a wailing, metallic howl rolling across the treetops, like 1,000 factory sirens tearing themselves apart.
Veterans later wrote that for a second, nobody moved, because nobody understood what they were hearing. Some thought it was a chemical alarm. Some thought it was a new Soviet air weapon. Some believed, for an instant, that it wasn't earthly at all. Then, the ground erupted. Fire didn't fall in single bursts. It cascaded in sheets. Trucks lifted and twisted. Barrels ruptured. Fuel bloomed into pillars of smoke, and supply columns that were supposed to feed the German advance became funeral pyres instead. But the damage wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the realization the rear was no longer safe. That was the psychological fracture. The front line expects death. The supply line does not. When the soldiers behind the guns feel hunted, the soldiers in front of them start dying on schedule. And 82 years later, the emotion repeats, not the sound. Where Katyusha terrified with noise, HIMARS terrifies with silence. Russian logistics crews don't hear their doom approaching. There is no shriek, no warning. There is just a sudden surgical erasure. A facility that existed 5 seconds ago simply stops being there. Rear area troops don't run for cover, because they never know it is time to run. In 1941, German truck drivers feared the moment the scream began. In 2023, Russian truck drivers fear the moment nothing can be heard at all. They now drive with lights off, sleep in tree lines, whisper coordinates like secrets. Every depot feels temporary. Every fuel stack feels like bait. Supplies aren't just limited. They are cursed real estate, waiting for coordinates to become catastrophe. And this is how morale dies in modern war. Not by defeat, not by withdrawal, but by avoidance. A logistics officer may not mutiny. He simply delays departure until morning. A driver doesn't disobey. His truck breaks down before the route begins. A rail crew doesn't refuse. They just await repair orders that never come. Fear becomes punctuation, the silent pause between movement and hesitation. That same pause gripped German supply units in 1941. They weren't just afraid of rockets. They were afraid of being chosen by them. Katyusha became myth before it became statistics. HIMARS is doing the same, except differently. Not loud terror, but clinical inevitability. The Germans feared what they could hear approaching. The Russians fear what they can never detect until everything is already gone. And once a supply system begins to fear its own job, the front line is no longer fighting an enemy. It is fighting entropy. Because an army doesn't collapse the day it runs out of fuel. It collapses the day no one wants to deliver it anymore. No victory ever announces the moment it begins, and no collapse ever announces the moment it becomes irreversible. In 1941, German commanders outside Moscow still believed they were advancing, still drawing arrows on maps, still envisioning a triumphant push into the Soviet capital. But behind their artillery parks and forward command bunkers, the arteries of their army were already constricting. Fuel trucks were arriving half empty, or late, or not at all. Repair depots were working with scavenged parts because resupply trains had mysteriously slowed. Ammunition stocks were described as managed, which was a polite word for shrinking. This wasn't defeat, it was gradual paralysis. And German senior staff didn't understand it at first because they were looking at scorched craters and burned vehicles, measuring destruction in tonnage. They didn't realize they should have been measuring hesitation. That is how logistics collapses. Not in a crash, but in a hesitation repeated until it becomes routine. Fast forward to Kupiansk. The Russian general staff still spoke of counterattacks and stabilization, but the HIMARS strike had already planted something more dangerous than shrapnel. It planted doubt. Fuel routed through Belarus? Maybe tomorrow. Rail columns through Luhansk? Wait until nightfall. Convoys across exposed crossings? Better to hold until a safer window. That safer window never appears, because the act of waiting is the failure. Where Katyusha ripped fear into German supply columns through terror and spectacle, HIMARS achieves the same collapse through invisible certainty, the knowledge that wherever a depot stops long enough to matter, it becomes coordinates. Not fighting, not maneuver, just being located becomes a death sentence. The doctrine breaks before the army does. Blitzkrieg didn't fail in 1941 because German tanks suddenly became worse. It failed because the doctrine depended on momentum, and momentum depends on fuel that arrives on time. The same vulnerability lives inside Russian doctrine today. Modern Russian operations are built on the Soviet inheritance of mass, not flexibility. They consume ammunition like oxygen, fuel like pulse, shells like movement itself. But mass warfare dies the moment the pipeline behind it clogs. A tank without fuel isn't a vehicle, it's terrain. A railway without security isn't infrastructure. It's a target waiting to graduate into wreckage. And a logistics officer who is more afraid of detection than of dereliction isn't careful. He is already part of the collapse. The rear is the real battlefield. The Germans didn't lose outside Moscow when they were pushed back. They lost when their supply roads became predators' territory. The Russians aren't losing depots today. They're losing the confidence to operate them. History doesn't repeat because men forget. History repeats because systems behave the same way under the same pressures. When rockets make the rear unsafe, the front becomes starving flesh on borrowed time. When resupply becomes risk, tactics become irrelevant. When movement becomes fear, momentum is already dead. And yet, neither side, not in 1941, not in 2023, admits this moment when it arrives. Armies do not say, "We are collapsing." They say, "We are relocating supply. We are reorganizing routes. We are stabilizing the sector." But words do not move fuel, and optimism does not move ammunition. Only trucks do, and trucks don't drive into crosshairs. Not willingly. The German command didn't understand the nature of their problem until the winter sealed their immobility. The Russian command is now learning the same lesson, except this time, winter isn't the executioner. Precision is.
When the first Katyusha strikes thundered into the German rear, Berlin believed it was merely a new enemy artillery system. But the officers in the field quickly understood. This wasn't artillery. This was a new battle space. The front was no longer the line of contact. The front was wherever supply dared to stand still. The Germans suddenly found themselves fighting a war they hadn't prepared for. Not a maneuver war, but a logistical survival war. Everything behind the line, convoys, depots, fuel parks, even field kitchens, could be annihilated without warning. They tried to compensate. They began spreading fuel dumps instead of centralizing them. They camouflaged railheads with forest cover. They rotated depot locations constantly. They built decoy storage fields using empty barrels and abandoned trucks. But all of this adaptation came after the psychological shock, and everything done in reaction
is already a concession of initiative. The Russians in 2023-2024 are now trapped in this same adaptation cycle. HIMARS is no longer a weapon system. It is a constraint on movement. Every kilometer of rail now has to be questioned. Every warehouse needs to be temporary by default. Every truck stop is a gamble with coordinates. Ukraine doesn't need to destroy 100 depots. It just needs the Russians to believe any depot could be next. This is what doctrine collapse looks like. When a military no longer behaves according to its pre-war planning, but according to its enemy's artillery range. The moment strategy turns defensive without saying so. There is a quiet moment in every long war where the attacker stops pushing forward and starts protecting what they already have. In 1941, this moment passed silently through German staff maps. The arrows didn't shrink yet, but they stopped growing. Today, the Russians face the same moment. They still talk about future offensives, but their fuel moves like a hunted animal. Their ammunition travels only by permission of darkness. Their rail lifelines are not arteries. They are exposure points. You can't threaten a breakthrough tomorrow when your fuel might not exist tomorrow. History repeats not in spectacle, but in pressure points. Forced evolution is evidence of fear. The Wehrmacht adapted because it was forced to. Russia is adapting because it has no choice. Not innovation, necessity. Camouflage nets everywhere. Rapid offloading of wagons. Mobile fuel instead of static tanks. Decoy depots made from scrap piles. These are not signs of strength. They are signs of breathing room being lost. Logistics doesn't lie. If a supply officer must hide, the army is already bleeding initiative. The enemy's doctrine is now your shadow. Katyusha rewrote German logistics by fear of saturation fire. HIMARS is rewriting Russian logistics by fear of precision fire. Both systems reach deeper than the front line, deeper than tactics, deeper than firepower. They reach into decision-making itself. And when your decisions are no longer based on your plan, but on what might hit you next, you are no longer conducting a war, you are surviving one. In 1941, the Germans had not yet retreated, but they had already stopped advancing. In 2023, the Russians still hold territory, but they no longer control time. And the side that loses time always loses momentum next.
There is always a delay, a silent lag between logistics collapse and battlefield collapse. The front line never knows immediately that it has been abandoned by the arteries meant to feed it. It realizes slowly, like a man tightening a tourniquet around his own arm without noticing the color fade. In 1941, German units outside Moscow were still writing optimistic situation reports while their supply lifelines were already gasping. They believed fuel was en route. They believed ammunition would be restored by morning. They believed cold weather was temporary and logistics strain was an inconvenience. Then one morning, the belief simply expired. It began with little panic signals. Batteries rationed, patrols canceled because fuel must be conserved, tank crews instructed to hold positions instead of maneuver. Commanders knew these weren't tactical adjustments. These were survival measures. Soldiers on the ground began to feel exposed not because the Soviets were pressing harder, but because their own rear no longer felt solid. A front line without a trusted rear becomes a cliff edge. The same realization spreading through Russian lines today. In the Kupiansk sector, Russian infantry are not panicking because of HIMARS strikes hitting them. Most of the time they are nowhere near the craters. They are panicking because when they radio for resupply, they hear silence, or delay, or excuses. Shells are coming later. Fuel column is waiting for orders. Truck losses are being assessed. No soldier needs a map to understand what this means. He hears that tone only once logistics has become a liability instead of a guarantee. In trench interviews, Russian soldiers already admitted in coded language, "The front is normal. The problem is behind us." That is exactly what German troops wrote in diaries in late 1941 when they realized the offensive wasn't paused by resistance, it was starving from behind. Panic doesn't begin with running. It begins with doubt. The front line stops trusting promises. That is always the first crack. A German lieutenant near Klin wrote, "We are not being beaten by the enemy. We are being abandoned by distance." A Russian platoon leader in 2023 said almost the same line. "The enemy doesn't have to kill us. They just need to wait for our trucks to disappear." Neither man was talking about artillery. They were talking about certainty eroding into fear. When confidence goes missing, the most dangerous condition for any army is not low ammunition. It is anticipating low ammunition. That is when decision-making shrinks. Patrols become shorter. Positions are held instead of rotated. Commanders conserve instead of maneuver. Aggression dissolves into guarded stagnation. No doctrine can survive without confidence behind it. Katyusha taught the Germans that momentum is worthless if fuel fears the road. HIMARS is teaching the Russians that manpower is worthless if shells cannot reach the line. Armies are not defeated by gunfire. They are defeated by the moment soldiers stop believing tomorrow is supplied. The moment before the break, the Germans in 1941 did not realize their defeat had begun until winter sealed it. The Russians today have not yet named their problem, but their soldiers feel it. Supply is no longer a flow, it is a gamble. Rear areas are no longer safe ground, they are hunting grounds. And every depot that burns leaves behind not just wreckage, but a rumor that moves faster than trucks ever will, because a rumor is the first retreat no army can stop.
Armies never fall on the day they collapse. They fall on the day their logistics lose the will to move. And the front line doesn't understand the death sentence has already been signed. For the Germans in 1941, that reckoning arrived in winter, not because of snow, but because their supply lines had already withered into caution and fear. Fuel froze, yes, but spiritually, the momentum froze first. They were not pushed back from Moscow by force. They were starved backward by paralysis. Roads that once carried victory now carried absence. Convoys that once delivered strength now delivered excuses. Momentum didn't shatter. It ran dry. When the Katyushas first howled across those German rear areas, they were not destroying divisions, they were destroying futures. They were telling the Wehrmacht in fire and thunder, "You do not own tomorrow anymore." And the same message now hangs over Kupiansk. The modern echo. When HIMARS shells a depot, it is not attacking a building, it is attacking confidence. One strike doesn't kill a brigade. One strike kills the belief that the brigade can survive long enough to be resupplied. Russian planners still speak in offensives, but their trucks move like fugitives. Their fuel lives like a secret, and their ammunition travels like contraband through a minefield of coordinates. That is not a supply chain. That is triage disguised as planning. The Russians still hold kilometers on a map, but a military that hides its logistics no longer owns its battlefield. It merely rents it until the next strike updates the expiration date. History's lesson: the enemy you don't see is the one that wins. Katyusha broke morale with a scream that announced itself like a roaring omen. HIMARS breaks morale with the absence of warning, with quiet erasure instead of spectacle. The Germans looked to the sky and feared what they heard coming. The Russians look at their depots and fear what will vanish before dawn. One war howled, the other whispers. But they teach the same truth. The rear is the real battlefield. Kill the supply, and the soldier is already defeated. He just hasn't run out of breath yet. The legacy. Logistics is not the shadow of war. It is the spine of it. Katyusha was never just a weapon. It was the declaration that Soviet survival would be written not in tanks, but in the ability to turn the enemy's advance into a self-strangling overreach. HIMARS is the same declaration reborn with accuracy instead of volume. History did not repeat by coincidence. It repeated because once an army stretches beyond the reach of safe supply, its fate is no longer written at the front. It is written in the explosions behind it. In 1941, Germany discovered that momentum means nothing when tomorrow's fuel is already ash. In 2023, Russia is learning that territory means nothing when tomorrow's railhead is already coordinates. Artillery does not kill armies. Hunger does. Silence does. Fear behind the lines does. The front only learns last what logistics already knew first. The war was lost the moment the supply lines stopped believing they could live long enough to deliver victory.